Hello and welcome back to my channel where I give students advice on anything from finances to accommodation. So if you've clicked on this video, then chances are you're planning on travelling during your gap year, but also that you've watched a ton of other videos that don't even touch the surface on how to plan travel for your gap year. This video will be in-depth and useful, so go grab a notepad and a pen and get ready for my advice on how to travel on a budget. To start off with, you're going to start wanting to think about where you want to go. I'd advise looking on Google, Pinterest, Instagram pages, etc. And even if you suspect somewhere is going to be too expensive, then still consider it, because as I will show later, there are ways you can cut down on the cost of your trip. You don't necessarily need a reason to go somewhere other than it looks really pretty, but consider things like, will it be useful for your degree to be immersed in another language or culture? So next thing is to make sure that you plan really early. You need to consider that some countries you'll need things like visas and vaccinations, and you need to make sure that you've got enough time to sort these things out before you go. Also, you're probably going to need to budget and work to be able to afford to go, so make sure you give yourself enough time to do that. So next up, start thinking about who you actually want to go with. Some people want to travel by themselves, which is fine, but if you want to travel with other people, then you need to know early on, because for example, it could be cheaper to book a twin hotel room rather than 2 beds in a hostel room. So next thing is that you need to work out what your limitations will be. For a lot of people, these limitations will be the cost and whether they can afford to travel, but also what time of year they can go. So as I said, some people will only be able to travel at a certain time of year, but in any case, it's really important that you research the best time to visit that country. For example, we planned to go to Thailand when it was actually their monsoon season, which would not have been good. But it's obviously just as important to make sure that you can actually fund your trip. So if you're funding your trip yourself through employment, then I'd really advise getting a job first before you start thinking about this. That will then give you an idea about things like how much holiday you get, when you can take it. Another alternative is to work for a proportion of the year and then to travel afterwards. So I know a lot of people will work for 6 months and then travel for 6 months, but I suspect that a lot of employers would not employ you if they knew this, so I'd probably keep that quiet in the interview process. So how do you actually narrow down your choices? Hopefully once you know how much you have to spend on your travel, when you can travel, or when the best time to travel is, then you'll be able to narrow down your choices. Personally, I would not advise booking through a travel company if you're trying to do this on a budget, and so this is the order in which I would start booking things. So when you're starting the planning and the booking process, the very first thing I would do is to look at transport. If you're flying long haul, then transport is likely to be your biggest outlay, but even if you're not flying long haul, then it can still be quite an expensive cost. But even if flights to your chosen destination are looking really expensive, then still don't rule it out, because as I said earlier, there are ways that you can cut down on the cost. I would advise using Skyscanner when you're looking for flights, and be creative with flights as well. For example, there's an option on Skyscanner to look at whole months, so you can see when the cheapest time is to fly within that month. Another way to cut down on the cost is to add a layover into your flight, especially if you're flying long haul. So sometimes it's cheaper to fly halfway, get off and then fly again. Sometimes it's cheaper to fly to a neighbouring country and then to fly to your destination. So for example, it's often cheap to fly from the UK to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to Thailand, or the UK to Singapore, Singapore to Thailand, or Dubai and then Thailand, etc. Skyscanner does give you the option to search for split flights like this as well. Personally, when I'm looking for flights, I will look at the cheapest option and then go straight to their safety and their passenger ratings. If these ratings are looking okay, then I will go for that option, and otherwise I'll go to the next cheapest option and repeat the procedure. Don't forget to check whether baggage is included in the price as well, especially if you're adding on a short haul flight before your long haul. And even if cost is not an issue for you, not a limitation, then I would still advise looking at your flights or transportation first, because this will be the part of your trip that will often sell out the quickest. Just a quick heads up that if you're travelling to Asia, then your flights will be the most expensive part of your trip. But once you are there, it's really cheap to fly between cities or countries. So that's something that I would definitely advise doing, is taking a longer trip if possible, flying between cities or countries in Asia to make the most out of your trip. So for students wanting to travel around Europe, then I'd probably suggest an Interrail pass will be your cheapest option for travel. But having said this, if you are willing to travel really early or really late, then I've seen some really cheap flights under £20. So if you are going around Europe, then it's just up to you to decide how many countries you want to visit and whether it's worth getting that Interrail pass, otherwise it could be cheaper to fly. Also take into account that some countries will give you free travel as well once you're staying there. So for example, Switzerland give you free travel around the region you're staying in, and definitely at Geneva Airport, I'm not sure about the others, but at Geneva they will give you a free 80-minute travel ticket to get from the airport to where you need to stay. And this free travel card they give you at your accommodation covers trains, buses, ferries, so it really is excellent. But most importantly, wherever you're going, whether you're travelling short haul, long haul, please do make a top cashback account because you can get free cashback on any bookings that you make. So when we booked our flights to Thailand through STA Travel, we could have got £50 back, but I just completely forgot to go through top cashback, which is such a waste of money. You wouldn't expect things like vaccinations and visas to be a really big outlay, but they can be quite expensive, so I would definitely consider these very early on in your travel, and they would be the next thing that I would consider if I was planning a trip. Visas can be quite expensive, but they can be sorted fairly quickly. On the other hand, vaccinations you often need a couple of weeks before you travel, and sometimes like 2 or 3 vaccinations before you go. So you definitely need to make sure you've left time to have these before you go. You can cut down on the cost on other aspects of your trip, but vaccinations and visas are something that you just can't do that on, I'm afraid. So it's really important that you budget for these really early on. Accommodation is where you can really cut down on the cost of your trip. First and foremost, definitely be open to different sorts of accommodation, and by this point you definitely need to know who you'll be travelling with, if anyone. If you're travelling solo, then I'd suggest that hostels could be your cheapest and your safest option. But as I said before, if you're travelling with someone else, then definitely don't rule out hotels, as they could be cheaper to have a shared twin room rather than have 2 separate beds in a hostel room. And unless you're going somewhere really hot, when I wouldn't advise this, then it could be really cheap to take a small tent with you in a backpack, because campsites are just super cheap. If you do want to camp, then I would suggest just typing in campsites in whatever city you want to stay in and seeing where the best located ones are. Generally speaking, campsites all tend to be around the same sort of price, but they also tend to be outside of the city centre, which can then make it really expensive in terms of transport to get to the city. So I'd say location here is definitely the most important aspect to look for. So assuming that you're not camping, I would get that price low to high filter working on sites such as hotels.com, booking.com and Expedia. All of these sites are offering really good rates of cashback at the moment as well through top cashback. So when you're looking for accommodation, here are some things to consider. Firstly, will it be cheaper to have a hotel room rather than 2 beds in a hostel? If you're going to a hot country, then does the hotel or hostel, wherever you're staying, have air conditioning? You will not realise the importance of this until you get off that plane in that country. Some people will advise if you're going on a long trip for a long time, then don't book your accommodation until you get there. I agree this can be cheaper sometimes, but it's definitely a gamble, especially at the moment with COVID-19, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. It could be that hotels and hostels are working on half capacity for a little while, in which case it's going to be a lot harder to do this. Ultimately, if you're trying to find accommodation on a budget, then it's very likely that at least one place you stay isn't going to be amazing. But if you're really worried about this, then you can just take a really small sleeping bag with you. For example, I have the Snug Pack Jungle Bag, which is excellent. It's really small, really compact, and if you get like dirty bed sheets or anything, you can just use that instead. If you're going on a really long trip, then I'd advise mixing your accommodation up a bit. So hostels abroad can be renowned for being cheap, but also sometimes for being noisy. So if you've got some nights in hostels, some in hotels, then at least you know you'll get a good night's sleep sometimes, and it just mixes your accommodation up a bit and makes it more interesting as well. So be influenced by reviews, but don't just look at that number like 7 out of 10, because people could have commented things in their review that you're really not bothered about, so make sure you actually go through and read them. For example, an older person could write, I didn't like the hostel because there were too many teenagers, when actually that's exactly what you want from your trip. So booking a hostel or hotel right in a city centre might be marginally more expensive than one slightly on the outskirts, but consider how expensive transport is around the city, in which case it could actually be cheaper to book the marginally more expensive accommodation. Also consider how expensive food is in the place that you're visiting, and whether it could be better value to get a hostel or hotel with breakfast included, especially if it's a buffet breakfast, because you can fill yourself up loads at breakfast and then spend less on your lunch. So once you've got these things sorted, the next thing I would think about is definitely travel insurance. Now, I cannot stress enough how important it is to read the small print. I thought my £10 travel insurance for Thailand was going to be absolutely fine. Turns out that actually it not covering private hospitals meant that I couldn't see a doctor when I had a suspected blood clot, and I really should have. And yes, chances are that you probably won't have to use your travel insurance, but if you, in the unlikely event, do have to use it, then I can assure you, you spending £5 or £10 extra on it in the start will be so much easier for you if it does come to that. And that probably only equates to an extra 2 or 3 hours of work at your part-time job, so it's definitely worth it. To compare travel insurance quotes, I would advise looking on a comparison site. For example, Money Supermarket is excellent for this. The next thing you can start thinking about is activities. Now, to be honest, if you're going to a new city or just a new place, then a lot of the activities will be free, just you sightseeing. But if you do want to do any paid activities, then I would say don't overlook package deals. Obviously use your common sense, and if getting the bus is going to be half the price of booking the package deal, then obviously don't do it. Whilst we were in Thailand, we did do a couple of package excursions because with transport, lunch, drinks, all included in the day, it worked out a lot cheaper. So we actually did a city tour with a company called Megatour in Thailand, who are fantastic. So you're out all day for 5 hours in a luxury minibus. You get a free lunch, free drinks, and entrance to 6 attractions as well, which is excellent. And you literally get all of that for £24. It worked out as such good value, and we'd never have been able to see all of that in one day if we were trying to do it ourselves. So definitely start thinking about activities before you go, but I probably wouldn't book anything until I actually arrived in the country, because other factors can influence things such as how jet lagged you are and what you're going to want to do the next day. So once you arrive in the country, transport can get really expensive, especially novelty transport, so a black cab in London, a tuk-tuk in Thailand. Our tuk-tuk ride in Thailand was ridiculously expensive, from one beach literally to the next. We got scammed by a taxi and the buses never turned up. We quickly found out that the best way to get anywhere is to walk if you can. Obviously it's free and you see a lot on the way as well. If you do ever need a taxi anywhere, then the best way to sort it out is to go through your accommodation provider. It will be genuine and it will probably be cheaper as well. Next thing that you can start budgeting for is food. So be realistic with the cost of food. I would start looking at restaurants on Google Maps around the place you're staying, find an average price and then add on 10%, because it's always better to over budget. As long as you don't try to take liquids like I did to Geneva, then you can take snacks with you to cut down on the cost as well. As I said, if you're traveling to Asia, then the cost of food will be pretty cheap, well, very cheap, but this won't be the case everywhere. And one thing I would definitely say is that you'll want to eat more than you think you will before you go. It's very likely you'll be walking around a lot all day and you're going to burn more calories than you expect, and you'll probably want to snack a lot more than you think. It's also advisable in a lot of countries not to drink tap water, and often bottled water can be more expensive than buying alcohol. That was something we definitely found when we went to Thailand, so definitely budget for water as well. So overall, transport is going to be one of your biggest outlays and needs to be sorted first. You can cut down on the cost of transport to a certain extent, but definitely make sure you're comfortable, especially if you're flying long haul. Likewise, food is something that I would definitely advise not scrimping on, because essentially you need the food to enjoy where you are. Transport within cities and towns within the country you're staying can get really expensive, but if you're prepared to walk, then this can really cut down on the cost as well. Most importantly, check the small print of your travel insurance. So there are some things like vaccinations and visas that you just can't control the price of, but things like accommodation and transport, you can definitely cut down on the cost. So as always, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if it has been helpful to you, then let me know in the comments, like and hit that subscribe button as well.